Classic British engineering, elegant Italian styling, and mighty American power. These three elements were brought together by a unique combination of events at a time when car designers and manufacturers were prepared to take risks to create an extremely special and rare but largely forgotten motor car. This is the story of the Gordon Keeble, one of the great but not widely known supercars of the 1960s. During the 1960s, when most car drivers in the UK were travelling around in vehicles produced by Austin, Hillman, Vauxhall and Ford, a fortunate few were able to splash out on something a little different. Aston Martin, Jaguar, Maserati and other high-end car manufacturers are familiar names, and while some examples of these have not survived the decades that followed, many are still on our roads around the world, recognisable to the man and woman on the street, and not just those in the know. Many are cherished by their owners, having been lovingly restored, maintained and regularly driven, and are proudly displayed at car shows for the general public to admire. However, UK automotive history is littered with entrepreneurial car manufacturers such as Jensen, Jowett and Peerless, who, while showing great promise and engineering prowess, couldn't compete successfully with the larger scale operations in the UK and more significantly overseas. One other such marque, which succumbed to the financial pressures of the highly competitive car market of the 1960s, was the Gordon Keeble, which was built mostly in Eastleigh near Southampton on the south coast of England. You could be forgiven for asking the what, as it would have been easy to miss the production run, which lasted just 2 years, from 1964 to 1966, producing only 99 cars. The origins of the Gordon Keeble date back to the late 1950s, when the managing director of Peerless Cars, John Gordon, met a talented automotive engineer by the name of Jim Keeble.
John Gordon was the man behind the Peerless car. He'd had a racing background and he knew a lot of people that produced race cars at the time. And through Bernie Rogers and John Gordon, they got the Peerless setup going.
At the time, Jim was running a successful business in Ipswich, restoring cars and building one-off specials for his customers.
I could see Jim from the first hour or so that I met him. He was a brilliant engineer. He could produce anything, he could make it, he could design it, weld it, fabricate it and still drive it, and you don't get many people like that these days.
One of Jim's customers, Rick Nielsen, a US Air Force pilot based at RAF Bentwaters in Suffolk, had an idea to combine a powerful American engine with a lightweight British sports car to support his racing ambitions, and asked Jim if he would install a Chevrolet V8 engine into a Peerless. This led to Jim approaching John Gordon to ask if John would sell him a Peerless chassis. John agreed, but on the condition that Jim's work would be carried out in the Peerless workshop. A deal was struck and work began.
John Gordon could see the brainchild there of putting a Corvette engine into a larger chassis and a proper four-seater car, and he engaged Jim to design a chassis to take the Corvette engine. Unfortunately,
all was not well at Peerless. The appointment of a new director resulted in John Gordon resigning from Peerless Cars, although he did retain his position at the sister company, Peerless Motors, and it was there in Slough that work on Rick Nielsen's car continued.
John Gordon left the board of directors of Peerless Cars, and behind the Peerless Motors, which were the Jaguar distributorship for Buckinghamshire, on the Bath Road at Slough, there was a small workshop, and we started there by laying down the first tubes of the chassis. I worked with Jim, and Jim was on the drawing board, and we worked alongside each other, and within 3 months we'd actually produced the whole running working chassis, suspensions and everything ready to roll.
It wasn't long into this new arrangement that John Gordon and Jim Keeble started to discuss the idea of developing a brand new car, and they formed the Gordon Automobile Company. Known initially as the Gordon GT, work on the chassis design and the sourcing of components began in November 1959. While Jim was overseeing that work, John took responsibility for organising the body design, Having originally met Lucio Bertoni at the 1949 Mille Miglia, and having struck up an immediate rapport with him, John asked Bertoni to be responsible for the design of the body. Bertoni duly arranged for Giorgetto Giugiaro, one of his new young designers, to do the design work. It was to be only his second major project, and the first example of his work to be shown to the public. By January 1960, Jim had completed the chassis, and fitted with a Chevrolet engine that had originally been earmarked for Rick Nielsen's Peerless, it was shipped to Turin to be united with Giugiaro's newly designed steel body.
Jim actually went across to the Bertoni's factory where he saw the bodywork being made. The whole steel body, the chrome work, the glass, the interior trim was made in 28 days. That was mounted onto the chassis that we produced in 3 months, and it was the steal of the show at Geneva Motor Show on the Bertoni's stand. When we got the car back, we then had to make it a runner. And the first magazine to get their hands on the Gordon GT was the Autocar. And when the Autocar had it for a week, they tested the prototype. They said it was the most electrifying car they'd ever tested.
The word spread, and many motoring magazines queued up to drive the Gordon GT and publish their unanimously positive reviews.
The future was quite rosy because the motor show created a lot of orders for the car.
However, John Gordon was losing money at Peerless, and he ceased production of the Peerless GT in 1960. He tried to keep up interest in the Gordon GT and worked hard to raise money and make deals, including a trip to America. He and the Gordon GT prototype set sail on the Queen Elizabeth and met senior figures at General Motors, including Zora Duntov and Ed Cole.
The prototype was taken to America with John Gordon, and it was taken to the test track at General Motors, where Zora Duntov, the man who designed the Corvettes, actually drove the Gordon GT around their test track, and it outperformed their own car, the Corvette, with the Corvette engine in, and they had full admiration for what Jim's design turned out to be.
Ed Cole proposed supplying John Gordon with Corvette V8 engines and gearboxes for an all-inclusive £400 each, and placed an order for 1,500 cars to be displayed in Chevrolet dealerships. Sadly, it was not to be. Despite the high praise that the Gordon GT was receiving, the Gordon Automobile Company experienced great difficulty raising finance. John had approached many people with a view to gaining strong financial backing, but with little success. Eventually, however, having previously met John at a press launch, George Wansborough, the former chairman of Jowett Cars, and incidentally my father, accepted John's invitation to become a director of the Gordon Automobile Company, and work started afresh on fundraising. Typical of the company's experiences, this took longer than expected, with finance being a problem, and the three men would often clash in meetings. In the end, the position was unsustainable, and with only the prototype Gordon GT built, John Gordon left the company. George Wansborough became chairman and spent the next 2 years approaching potential investors, demonstrating the prototype, and suggesting plans for putting it into production. In that time, Jim had returned to Ipswich, and Derek Baker followed to continue working under Jim's wing. Derek worked hard making the chassis components for a total of 5 cars, in between working with Jim on his customer projects. In the middle of 1963, George Wansborough recognised that it wasn't going to be possible to raise the necessary finance from independent investors, and decided to go ahead on a much smaller and therefore much more risky scale, using virtually all the family's savings as well as bank loans guaranteed by him. This enabled the company, which was now called Gordon Keeble Limited, to rent the old Saunders Row machine shop at Eastleigh Airfield, now known as Southampton Airport, and a production operation was set up. It's an interesting fact that the first test flight of the famous Supermarine Spitfire took place at this airfield on March the 5th, 1936. No doubt this influenced one of the company's later advertising slogans, "The car built to aircraft standards."
Eventually money was found through George Wansborough, and we came down to Eastleigh Airport, to the old Saunders Row machine shops.
People were so excited because this car was being produced in Eastleigh. I was a fitter, and I used to start off by building the bottom of the chassis up, putting in the bits that done all the silencing of the car, and then I used to pop rivet along the sides, through the chassis, back, front, all the way around. And from there, I moved along the production line, putting the bodies on. It's like a personal shop. Well-known people came in. Sir somebody, a film star, or somebody came along. And, they were brought on a factory tour. All the guys got on together, worked well.
Never had any problems with anybody. We just got you just got on with your job and did the best you could. The metal workers and sheet metal workers and aircraft fitters putting the car together, and they wanted motor mechanics, to do certain work, but I didn't actually end up doing anything mechanical. I was just sort of helping, put the car together, sort of thing, as required.
The decision to switch to faster to build, more affordable glass fibre body shells had been made, and finally, in 1964, those first 5 chassis built by Derek Baker found themselves becoming cars. Production of the GK1 proved to be more expensive than anticipated, and some parts were hard to get hold of. The company was running into problems, along with the rest of the British motor industry. Component supply interrupted by strikes, and suppliers concentrating on larger contracts, all meant that production encountered repeated setbacks which threatened the company's existence.
We had full order books when we'd exhibited the car at the London Motor Show at Earl's Court. We had really full order books there, probably 40 to 50 orders.
The order book was full, but we had trouble getting some of the parts. The most problem we had was the steering boxes.
They couldn't produce the steering boxes for us because they were producing for other manufacturers in the motor industry. Therefore, we had a number of cars that were completely finished and we couldn't get them on the road because we didn't have the steering boxes for them. And that was the crux. This is where people started to pull their deposits away, and this was the downfall of the factory.
Although the boxes eventually arrived and production resumed, the damage to cash flow and profitability proved terminal, and in May 1965, Gordon Keeble Limited went into liquidation.
We all went to work one day, and we were all working away at our benches and on the cars, and somebody shouted out, "Stop!" And they asked us to leave the building because they run out of money, and the bank had foreclosed on it, and that was the end. And then you had no option but to pick up what you could on the way out, and that was it.
The liquidators were brought in eventually. People tried hard to get their holiday money out of the company. Certain people did. I was on the staff at the time. I was okay, but a lot of my friends didn't get even holiday money paid, and it was a sad, sad situation.
A new company, Keeble Cars Limited, was incorporated in July 1965, and that led to a short run of Gordon Keeble's being produced in Sholing in Southampton.
We moved over to Sholing, and then we got all the rest of the parts there and started to build them again,
I went back when they moved to Sholing. There was only 9 cars produced there. The next one up from the original design had little air vents put into it, but that was very, very late in production. And it did help cool the car a little bit, but you can't say it was super efficient for cooling. Basically, the same thing happened again after a short while. So I came away with a check for £3, I think, at that time.
If it hadn't have been that particular year and money was still around and they could have built the cars with those steering boxes, I'm sure the company would have still been going today, and Jim would have been heading a lovely corporation.
We'd hope to see this one be the Mark 1, and then we move on to a Mark 2 and keep going, because the actual concept was absolutely wonderful. The order book was full, and I think it would have gone on to greater things, really. There must have been something, in his mind at that time, Jim Keeble's, to make it go further.
He had all sorts of ideas. He had a 2-litre Keeble that was on the cards. Couldn't get the power steering boxes in the early days. They weren't available. He had a produced the Mark II with a power steering and so on, and all the modifications that he'd like to have put into the Mark II. But of course, the car didn't keep going long enough for that to be used.
Of the original 99 cars built, a high proportion still exist, and many are roadworthy and driven regularly. The remarkable survival rate of the Gordon Keeble is largely attributable to the passion, commitment and expertise of one man, Ernie Knott. Ernie ran Knott's Coachworks in Brackley. He established the Gordon Keeble Car Centre and founded the Gordon Keeble Owners Club.
Ernie had started as a sign writer, and from that he became the sign writer for Silverstone Circuit, and he also was the numberer, and that then led him from sign writing cars into actually repairing them as Knott's Coachworks. And then one day when he was at Silverstone, he saw a Gordon Keeble and he thought, I want one of those.
He saw one at Silverstone in 1968, I think it was, and decided that he had to have one, which he did manage. He scraped together £800 to buy one with a broken camshaft and towed it back from Evesham to Brackley, got it running, and the rest is history, really.
And having bought one, he suddenly found, because he'd got a garage, that he was offered the spares. And he bought the spares for Gordon Keebles with a friend, Peter Jones, who he subsequently bought out a couple of years after that and formed the Gordon Keeble Car Centre. Once he got his Gordon Keeble, then he made it a mission to find other Gordon Keebles and formed the Gordon Keeble Owners Club.
Ernie started the club. He could see a niche there. He advertised in the magazines. He's starting the Gordon Keeble Owners Club. Eventually got everyone filtering through that own Keebles, and Ernie's been responsible for keeping the cars on the road over all these years.
For a while, the club did nothing more really than rely on Ernie for finding or remanufacturing some of the parts to keep the cars going. And to that extent, we owe everything to Ernie that there are the cars still on the road today.
Because he'd formed the club and he had a garage and then had been offered the spares, obviously it became a natural thing to let the owners know that the spares were available and that he was capable of repairing them.
The club grew from that because it was easier for people to go to there and get the pieces that they were needed. And especially if you're on a restoration, because there's quite a number that needs a lot of tender love and care now.
So he did a lot of modifications, but those modifications were always carried out and made sure that they were right on his own car.
He used it as a test bed for doing all his modifications, and if it worked on his, he'd sell it to somebody else if they wanted it. And he did very well out of that. But his main thing was that it had to be modified and it had to be red and possibly with gold wheels. I'm not quite sure it was everybody's cup of tea that his car had gold wheels, but he seemed to like it, so that was all that mattered really.
The car has survived, in my opinion, because of Ernie Knott. Ernie had a car bodywork business, and lots of cars have been hit in some shape or form, and many of them have been repaired by Ernie. If Ernie hadn't been bound to repair them, I think a lot of them would have been written off. So there would have been one or two survivors, but there would not be the same interest in the marque. It would be a much more obscure sort of thing than it is. It was Ernie's enthusiasm, which I think is the reason why it survived.
Ernie was the one who saved Gordon Keeble. I think his restoration shop, his work, his enthusiasm spread. His enthusiasm, I think, sparked the Owners Club.
I think it's fair to say that he was responsible for the survival of so many cars. I think most of them would have gone by the way a long time before. I just remember him as a very passionate man and a lovely man.
Not only did Ernie Knott ensure that many Gordon Keebles survived and remained roadworthy, when without him they might not have done, he was also involved in the production of an iconic piece of Gordon Keeble memorabilia. Let me explain. There's a strong desire within the Gordon Keeble Owners Club to ensure that the story of this great car is not lost. The marque receives the recognition it deserves, and records are kept to be passed on to future custodians of the cars. Taking this commitment to gather and preserve records one step further, Ernie Knott and his friend Charles Giles undertook to write and publish a book documenting the origin, development and production of the Gordon Keeble, as well as the motor industry's reaction to it. The book was also written to tell the story of the creation of the Gordon Keeble Register, which was the beginnings of what was to become the Gordon Keeble Owners Club.
The Gordon Keeble book came about because we had a friend in Switzerland called David Harris, and one day he said, "I think you ought to write a book on Gordon Keeble." So Ernie came back, and because by that time Charles had become historian, Charles Giles, they set to and they started to do a book.
Every time I saw Ernie, he would say, "Chaz," that's how he used to call me, "we really ought to have a book." I said to Ernie, "Look, if you do your bit on the Gordon Keeble, I'll write my bit. So we'll share it as a project. We'll write it and then see what can be done." I did the half about the history of the car, and Ernie then wrote about the formation of the owners club and the modifications of various owners, and that was the way that we did it. Owners were asked to chip in a little bit of money to get the project off the ground, and a few owners did, and so the book was published and are quite sought after now.
From its inaugural meeting in 1970 to the current day, the Gordon Keeble Owners Club continues to thrive thanks to a core of knowledgeable members and a dedicated committee. The club's members relish attending shows, displaying their cars and raising the profile of the marque.
The club was started by Ernie Knott back in 1970. The very first meeting was in July 1970, and he had put an advert in both Motor and Autocar magazine for all owners of Gordon Keebles to get in touch with him and to come to an inaugural meeting for what he hoped would become the club.
The first show we did was at Alexandra Palace, and they were overwhelmed that we wanted to go, and and we just went with our own car because it was the first show we'd ever done, and that was because Ernie had said he was fed up that Jensens were fetching more money than Keebles and they rotted, and I said to him, "Well, people don't know about the car, so we have to start going to shows," and he thought, right, and so off we started with the shows.
We always have a stand at the NEC Motor Show, and we have enthusiastic members that loan their cars to go on the stand. Some of the time, people think we're producing a brand new car because the chassis has been got up to brand new condition, even though they're 50 plus years old.
I was then introduced to the Gordon Keeble community. I was received extremely well, and they were looking for a membership secretary. And anybody that knows Anne will know that as vice president, if she suggests something like you become the chairman, it's not a suggestion, it's pretty much a command. And nobody, I think, in my 16 years that I've been involved in the club has ever been asked and refused. So I didn't think it was me to start a new piece of history.
I have been persuaded by various persuasive people to become a committee member. Through that you meet more and more people, and the overall impression is what a great bunch of people. I have massively enjoyed being involved with them, hope to be for quite a number of years, and I just like the fact that it is really like a little family. There aren't that many of us. I think that we currently run at about just over 70 members, but we're all friends, which is a great thing.
I thoroughly enjoy my time with the Keebles, and the more importantly, the Keeble members. We are a small club, I appreciate that, and I'm delighted to be part of it.
I think thanks to some of the people in the club, like Roy Dowding, that the message of the Gordon Keeble is spreading further and further, and I think more people are becoming aware of it because the club is having a greater presence, I think, in a lot of the car shows like the NEC. So people are becoming more aware of it.
There are people that are in the club that can pretty much name every chassis number and who owns them. I have to be reminded what chassis number I've got. They say, oh yeah, yours is, what chassis number is mine? Oh yes, that's right, it's number 20. And they can tell you who owned it before me and tell you when it was featured in a magazine.
I had a ticket to Silverstone. There was a meet on there. I don't know what it was, some classic car meet. So I found out there was an owners club, which I wasn't aware of. I went down there and met a couple of the guys. I just said that I was thinking of buying this Keeble. I still had no idea really that it was such a tight-knit community. And when they said, oh, that must be chassis number 30, eh? So they knew exactly what it was, what colour it was, and everything about it.
They have 4 magazines a year, and they tell you all about what everyone's sort of up to. And also having that and keeping in touch with a few people and going to the NEC show. You know, there's always 2 cars up there, and it's just great to see them again. You know, I just wish I'd bought one. You know,
I've been in the Gordon Keeble Club since I bought the car in 1976, and I think I must be the longest owner now. Well, 1 or 2 members that have now sold their cars and retired from the game were in it a year or 2 longer than me, but they've now gone, and I suspect I'm now the old man.
People's introductions to the Gordon Keeble marque vary as much as the cars themselves. From family connections and chance encounters to admiration of the engineering and childhood ambitions of ownership, what connects them all is their love of the Gordon Keeble.
My first recollection of a Keeble was going on holiday every year in one, towing quite a large caravan that he regularly towed at about 80, 90 miles an hour. We'd get part of the way and the car would usually break down somewhere along the way, which didn't seem to bother my father, because within a couple of minutes he'd have a big crowd of people around asking what the car was, and you'd just stand there chatting, telling everybody about what it was. And in the end we'd get going and get to our holiday.
I delivered to Ernie parts, and I had to be trained to do the job because I took orders as well. So I was taken in by the guy, Bill, who was training me. And when we got to the Gordon Keeble's car centre, there's 3 Keebles parked outside. And I went, oh, wow, look at those cars. And he went, yeah, I know. And went in. And I fell in love with the car the minute I ever saw one. From there on, I just got to know about the cars. I got to know about the workshop. By the time Ernie was not well and needed to retire, I'd worked in the workshop, painting, spraying, rubbing down Keebles, learning like I was an apprentice.
My first recollection of a Gordon Keeble was many, many years ago when I was an apprentice. I was apprentice at S.E. Hamblin in Sherborne. I remember there was a lad called Keith Murphy who did work on the fiberglass side. His family moved to Southampton, and one day I said to him, what are you going to do when you get to Southampton? And he said, well, I've got a job with Gordon Keebles, making up the glass fibre bodies. And that is the first time I've ever heard of a Gordon Keeble. But I mean, we're talking when the car was new, so he went off to build Gordon Keeble bodies, and that was the last I heard of him.
I owned a Peerless car, which was designed by John Gordon, and I bought that in around about 1960, and the Gordon Keeble appeared in late 63, early 64, but their production was a bit slow, so they didn't really get going until mid to late 64. But as soon as I saw it, I thought, well, that's fantastic. That's a car that shows all the engineering problems of the Peerless engineered out. After a bit, I started looking for a second-hand one. There weren't many. I came across one in Derbyshire, at Melbourne. So I went down to have a look at that. And that was the one I eventually bought. It looked very nice. And it's only after I bought it that it turned out that it was the Auto Motor magazine demonstrator. And that's when I joined the Gordon Keeble Owners Club, which was run by Ernie Knott in Brackley. And he supplied me with some of the early literature. And that's when I discovered that the car I'd got was actually quite special.
The Observer's Book of Automobiles. Yeah, this is a little book which I had when I was a kid. Yeah, like most boys, I guess, I was keen on cars and stuff like that. My dad was into cars, and I also liked the numbers and the Gordon Keeble. Apart from the fact it looked really lovely, it had by far the biggest engine. You know, it was about the fastest in the book. That's where I first spotted one in there.
My father had an E-Type, and he had two children, my sister and myself, and we were too big to sit behind the seats in the E-Type. So he wrote to Autocar and said, could they recommend a car? This is how things were done in those days. And they said, you might want to consider the Gordon Keeble. So he took me up to the 64 Earls Court Motor Show, where Gordon Keeble was sharing the stand with Amphicar, and looked at the car, and he placed his order. And in December 64, he took delivery of his car number 50. In 1987, I decided to take the plunge and buy my own car, and I wanted a car which was original. Ernie and I were very great friends, but we disagreed profoundly on whether a car should remain original or whether it should be modified.
I was always keen on Gordon Keebles because the guy who ran the local automotive spares shop, he was a bit of a driver, racing driver or whatever, amateur racing driver, and he had a Gordon Keeble at one time. The thing that attracted me, A, they're beautiful cars, and B, they're fiberglass. I've always been a fan of fiberglass cars because they don't go rotten. So I'd always kind of hankered after a Gordon Keeble, but they're very rare. And I mean, the truth of it was I couldn't afford one. They were too expensive. And it was only when I kind of just about retired, and I thought, if I don't buy one now, I'm never going to be able to have one. So it took me a couple of years to find one, but then I saw an advert for one that was restored but needed recommissioning. And that's when I kind of found my first one.
I am of an age where they were introduced during my sort of driving lifetime, and it was a car which was always extremely intriguing for all sorts of reasons which are blindingly obvious when you look at the car and read about it. But raising a family, buying a house, you don't even think of having something like that. But because I've always been into motoring, the Gordon Keeble crops up fairly regularly in the motoring press. And I've never actually seen any negative comments about the car, which was always quite encouraging. And then purely by chance, we went down to Goodwood, to the revival meeting. I saw then this beautiful green Gordon Keeble. There's something about the car that immediately struck me. And I asked the custodian of the car if it was for sale, and he said, no, it's not. So I said, right, I'm going to ask you something else. Could I come down and have a proper look at your car, which appeals massively to me, so that I can make a proper comparison with other cars if I do decide to go shopping? Well, yeah, of course you can. Come down and have a look at it. And having had a proper look at it, I said, are you absolutely sure it's not for sale? Well, possibly. So our conversations ensued, and Judith and I went down once again, and Barry had decided that he had other uses for the money at the time, so he said, yes, it can go. I spoke to another couple of members of the club and said, do you know the car? Yes, we do. I'm thinking of stepping into the water. What do you think? And the general opinion was, you couldn't go far wrong with that car. So the funds were distributed to him, and he delivered the car to us. And it's been in our garage ever since, being used regularly.
I've always had a fascination in cars, particularly classic cars. and I was born in Winchester, and interested to hear that there was a company in the 60s making a car literally down the road from me. I found out more about the car, very much liked the design, the shape, and thought one day I would like to own one of these cars. When I actually saw one, and I fell in love with it really, and just destined to own one day. So I bought the car in about 2006. It didn't really need a great deal of work doing to it. It had been restored. So other than routine maintenance, it hasn't really let me down.
Why do I have a Gordon Keeble? We go back to sometime in the autumn of 1960, when the Autocar magazine broke new ground in testing a prototype car. First time they'd ever done so. That was the Gordon GT. And given that I only had a pedal bike at the time, a car that could do 0 to 60 miles an hour in about 7 seconds was just unheard of. And I decided I've got to have one of those. And then, of course, it was only the Gordon GT. They took 4 years to get the money together, by which time I'd forgotten about it. Then in 1964, there was a road test of one of the production cars, one of the very earliest. Blimey, they actually did start making them. So speaking to my, what was then girlfriend, that car that I fell in love with 4 years ago, they're actually making them. And, well, no. We're saving for a house and to get married. The time will come. Oh, okay. Well, the time took a while. It was 1989 when eventually, prompted by one of my old school friend's sons, he turned around and he said, if money was absolutely no object, what car would you most want? And for some reason or another, instantly I said, a Gordon Keeble. He phoned me up about 2 days later. He'd done a little bit of research. Wow, yes, I can see why you'd want one of those. Bertone design, electrifying performance. Wow, yes. Why don't you get one then? And then I thought, why don't I? So I contacted the Gordon Keeble Owners Club, asked if any cars were available. I tested 3 before getting the one that I finally settled on.
I saw an article in Auto Week magazine around 1990. It's a weekly publication, and just in the one of the last pages, they had a column of, oh, by the way, here's some interesting cars. And it was the Gordon Keeble. I had never heard of one before, but I had grown up around Chevrolet V8 engines and saw this English car, Italian styling, American engine. It just seemed pretty nice. And I said, one day we'll go to England and look up a Gordon Keeble and see about it. And then it was not long ago, Hemmings monthly magazine, which is a monthly catalog about 1.5 inches thick of nothing but classified ads for cars and parts of everything. One day it'll show up in pages of Hemmings, and lo and behold, there was a Gordon Keeble in the States for sale. It was up at a dealership in Maryland outside of Washington, D.C. And Barbara's niece's husband and she were stationed up there at the Pentagon. So I called Bob up. I said, would you go out and look at this car for me? It's just 25 miles away. He says, I'd be glad to. So he did. Reported back that it's, an unusual car in good shape, good condition. So I telephoned the dealer and we bought it.
He had been buying and selling cars for quite a while. And it would always be like, he would be looking at Hemmings, as we were reading in bed, I would be like studying the Sunday school lesson and he would be studying his Bible, Hemmings. And it was always, oh, here's the car I've always wanted. And after about the 3rd or 4th car, I kind of caught on, So it was just shrug your shoulders and accept it. He had a British car when we met. He had a 74 TR6, which he still has. So we made a deal when he wanted to buy the second car that he could buy a car as long as he was willing to pay twice what they were asking for it. Because if he got a car, I got a nice piece of jewelry.
The garage is full, the jewelry box is overflowing.
Gordon Keeble owners love to show their cars, not only to raise the profile of the marque, but also to see the reactions that they get from curious members of the public and to answer their inevitable questions.
People look at it and go, wow, what's that? Everywhere we go on shows, there's always people coming around that haven't seen one before, and they just go, oh, wow, and they're there.
Most people don't know what it is even now, even though there's so much more publicity about the car and the internet has helped and so on and so forth. Most people say, oh, is it a Bristol or something like that? It's a very, very common reaction. And but most people admire it and consider it a nice car to look at.
People like to see the Gordon Keeble. They like the badge, which is the tortoise on the front of the car. The Mustang and the Jaguars and the Ferraris all have fast animals that predict there and make them look really, really good. But Jim wanted something which was totally different. They were out on a film shoot one day, and a tortoise actually crossed the road on the film shoot. He picked the tortoise up, he put it on the wing of the car. It immediately did a whoopsie. The urine spoilt the paint on the car. He had to get the wing repainted, but he thought this is going to be the emblem.
Everybody loves them. Ladies who you think would have no interest in cars, all these are lovely, they're so pretty and that sort of thing. And, not many people know what they are, so there's always a bit of a guessing game. The engine gives it away a little bit because you can tell it's a V8 and it's very different to modern cars.
One thing I've found going to car shows is that most people generally don't know what it is, and they think it's really quite a gentleman's carriage until you turn it on. And of course, when you start it up, there's usually quite a number of heads swivelling round because you've turned from a gentleman into a hooligan. And I think that's the initial impression that most people have of a Gordon Keeble is, Christ, that sounds fantastic. You can't fill up without somebody asking you what it is or something about it. Is it English is one of the questions. A lot of people think it's got Italian lines, which are perfectly well, it has got Italian lines. And that's part of the appeal, I think, that it looks like a properly designed car, which the Italians were very good at and still are. But it's got all the English features that you'd expect to have. We like to feel that we've got a little bit of power under our foot, and indeed we have. And that is another aspect which absolutely astonishes people when you open the bonnet, because it is so unexpected. Because most of them haven't seen or heard you arrive, and they think there's going to be perhaps a Ford or something underneath the bonnet, and no, it isn't.
My best moments with the Gordon Keeble are seeing people's reaction to it. There's nothing else. I have a few classic cars. I've got a Mark II Jaguar, and it just doesn't. A few people say, "Oh, that's the Morse car," but with the Gordon Keeble, it just creates so much more interest. People stop and turn around, and you can look in your rearview mirror, and they've followed you. Some people realise what it is. It's a Gordon Keeble, and driving it around Winchester, they know it was made locally, so that creates a lot of interest. Other people that don't know anything about cars will come up and say, "Oh, that's a nice car. What is it?" People ask so many questions. It just makes the car an enjoyable thing to own.
I have to say, the general interest shown as you're just driving around is considerable. You stop for petrol at a petrol station, and not only the guy in the kiosk, but other people on the forecourt will all come up. "What's this?" And when you tell them what a Gordon Keeble is, a what? And then you have to explain why it's called a Gordon Keeble.
For the last few years, we've been going to the classic car show at the NEC, and people come up and look at the car and admire it, and then they find out you worked on it. They want to know all about it.
We've twice been to the NEC over the last 10 years. The first time we were parked next but one to the entrance, and because it's bright orange under those lighting conditions, the orange really stands out. It makes it look like day glow. And people coming in through the main entrance could see this apparition and went straight to it to see what it was, because they didn't recognise the shape, because they'd never seen one. And after a bit, the people who were in the first stand, the Bristol Owners Club, got a bit upset by this and came around to say, well, is it possible to move your cars around? Because people are not stopping at the Bristol sign where all the cars were beautifully polished, and they were coming to see the one we had. And they said, well, of course, you're not allowed to move anything once the show starts. When you go to various shows, it always attracts attention because they're so unusual. And on one show, there's a big show up in the north of England that attracts something like 1,000 cars. So, a lot of people come. And I pin a notice on the window inside saying, well, it's a rare car, you probably won't see another. But that comment is always a goad, because quite often somebody who I know living in the Bradford area, or who used to have a car when he lived up in the Newcastle area, would come to the same show. And people would say, well, it can't be that rare. There's another one over there.
Anytime you go out in it, it's always interesting because people will say, what is that? And then you tell them a Gordon Keeble and they go, what is that? So it ends up being an educational opportunity.
The Gordon Keeble is, of course, a rare motor car, but to see one come up for auction is an even rarer sight. However, in September 2021, chassis number 70 was sold by the Dorset Vintage and Classic Auction House. It certainly created a stir in the lead-up to the auction, and there was no shortage of opinion after the event.
This is our first Gordon Keeble. Funny enough, I've had customers saying, if you ever hear of one for sale, but they're such a rare motor car, as you probably know, and most owners seem to look after them and keep them and never trade them out, really. I'm fairly confident it's going to sell.
Starting price, I believe, is somewhere around about 50,000. What it will get in the end, we don't know, but the average price runs from 50 to about 135. From £2,300 plus tax, it's not a bad investment.
People like unusual cars, and it'll probably end up in a collection with some other individual cars.
Yes, that has created a lot of interest. Certainly, at least one current Keeble owner is intrigued by buying it.
I hope that it is bought by someone who will appreciate it and drive it and keep it, going, because it's not that difficult a car to maintain.
It's a kids and dogs car. You can throw the kids in the back and not be upset if the dogs rides with you for a while. And that's what I think Barbara was saying. When somebody else has ownership of it, I hope it's used and not just stuck away in a corner like a piece of jewelry that stays in the bank that you don't wear.
216, there we are. This is one of the highlights of today's sale, the 965 GK1 Sports Saloon, Southampton's finest. Who's coming in at 40? 40, I'm bid. I'll take 42. 43 is fine. 44, 45. 45 is bid on the telephone. 46 is bid. I'll take 47. 47 is bid at £47,000 to a telephone bidder.
The fact they're so exclusive, I thought it would have made stronger money. I think whoever bought that car got a bit of a bargain. Yes, it might need a bit of recommissioning, but they are fairly simple to do. I understand there was no brakes at the time. Well, I mean, that's something that can be fixed fairly easily.
Because it needed work on it, I'm glad it went for a price where it was possible for somebody, if they've got the money and the incentive, to actually restore it up, Because once these cars reach, which they are slowly and surely reaching quite a good state of repair and condition, then they're more likely to survive. Yeah.
I hope that the person who's bought it is going to invest a little bit of love into it, and if he does, I would hope that a lot of his investment will be repaid. I mean, it went for about half the price of maximum cars, really. But obviously that was reflective of its condition. But no, I hope he's pleased with it and that he improves it and enjoys it.
If there's one thing that guarantees to polarise opinions of Gordon Keeble enthusiasts, it's electrification. Swapping the burble and roar of a Chevy V8 engine for the faint hum of an electric motor certainly has opinions divided.
What is my views on an electric Gordon Keeble? I think it's missing the point. I really think it's missing the point. The whole thing to me with the Gordon Keeble is its raw V8 power. So why would you put an electric motor in it? Maybe in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, I might think it's a good idea, but I don't think so.
I can see the point, and you can get electric E-types and electric Astons and so on and so forth. So I can see the thinking behind it. If you said to me, if you could have your car only if it was electric, and you know, otherwise it had to be crushed, for instance, then yes, I'd convert it to electric. But you must inevitably lose an awful lot of the character of the car if you take that great Chevy lump out of it. I'm not denigrating what people are doing, and it may well be eventually the way forward, but I don't think it's a problem that's going to arise in my lifetime.
It's every owner's choice that they want to do that, but I think for a classic car, I would hope that the way around it would be, obviously the usage is far, far less because you're not manufacturing anything, and that's where most of the emissions come from, really, in terms of the classic car, because you don't do very many miles. But I always hope that the answer for the classic cars, where for me the V8 engine is such a big part, the answer would be more in the fuel. I'd like to think there's a biofuel type of technology that would keep it going, because for me it would just it's lost its heart in a way if you take the engine away, and the sound, of course, is very different. But it's every owner's choice. I applaud them for trying something different. That's an interesting answer, but not the way I would be playing, I don't think.
I read about that in either Classic and Sports Car or Thoroughbred and Classic. I get those two English magazines doing I think a Tesla drivetrain with batteries in the trunk and in the front. To me, it's just wrong. An electric Gordon Keeble could probably be faster, quicker, whatever, but it doesn't have that heart. It does not have the Chevrolet engine, which is what attracted, I think, Ernie and these other people to it.
I am aware that one is being converted to electric power for a very specific reason. It's to do rallies. It was bought in bits and has never been truly representative of what we see every day as most of our Gordon Keebles. It's been put to competitive use and is being converted to electric, which will, from what I've been told, will give it even more straight line performance than the original, and that should be something worth seeing.
It doesn't trouble me. It doesn't trouble me particularly. I mean, it's the body shape that really attracts everybody. In my opinion, whatever keeps it going and keeps the car going. There are so few of them. If it comes to the fact that we can't put the right fuel in them anymore, it would be much better if we were to be able to do a mod that keeps the car going. If that's possible, that would be great, and I'm sure Ernie up there will be going, please find something to do with it.
So, whether they'll be powered by electric batteries, biofuel, or hybrid motors, the question is, what does the future hold for classic cars? And what hopes do the cars enthusiasts have for the future of the Gordon Keeble in particular?
Well, that it successfully carries on, that there's some youngsters that will come along and buy the old car and keep it all going. That's the main thing, because there's a lot of guys around like myself. We're all coming to the end of our times, but it would just be nice for it to know that with the Gordon Keeble Owners Club and everything else that goes on in the background. It'd just be something special to know it's all still going on in 50 years from now.
People sort of scaremonger, really, mainly classic press, really. But yeah, if you buy a magazine one month, they're saying, oh, everything's buoyant and it's wonderful, and the next month it's all down in the doldrums. But I firmly believe it does keep a steady course. I think the market will always be there, really, because it's such a big industry.
It really does rest on the club and the cars being able to get repaired properly.
I think you can only look so far into the future, but I hope that it will continue to attract an interest. I think in many respects the increase in the values is a good thing. There are a number of people who take the opposite view, but I feel that as the cars have become more valuable, the derelict ones become more worth saving. And, you know, I would like to, you know, for a Gordon Keeble to be written off is, to me, an absolute tragedy. And I hope that the value of them now means that we shouldn't see any more written off.
Oh, I think it will go on for a bit. I mean, it's now 60 years old, and of the original 100, there are still 92, 93 in existence. Few of those are probably not roadworthy, but they exist and could therefore be made roadworthy. But we know that 5 have been written off for one reason or another, crashed, burnt, vandalised or whatever. And there are 2 that got very badly rusty, but out of those 2, 1 can be salvaged. It'll be a mixture, but it can be salvaged. So, you know, out of the original production, 90% still exist after 60 years. The body, of course, will last forever. Yeah. And as the people can keep up with the chassis and the bearings, there's no reason why they couldn't go on for another 60 years.
Well, I think the interest will remain. You'll always have a newer owner. Somebody's going to take it over. But with the car, with that rarity, with that the style, and people will always be interested. I think there'll always be a market for it.
The ones that are around today have had a lot of work done to them. There's vulnerable areas on the chassis. A lot of them have had that work done. The bodywork has stood the test of time. They can transport 4 people in comfort. They've got 2 12-gallon fuel tanks. They're really a grand tourer. As long as the bodies hold together, and I'm sure they will because they were properly made. You don't see a crazed body on a Gordon Keeble. They were produced from a one-piece mould, and the bodies support themselves, the chassis support themselves, and the 2 together looked after, those cars will go on another 50 years easily. The right people have got the cars now. They like to spend on the cars, but they like to show their cars because they are so rare and they create so much interest. Anyone talking about a Gordon Keeble, the owner, he's on a pedestal because he's really proud of the car that he owns.
I would like to see it take its proper place in the history of the British motor industry. It was a tremendous concept, which unfortunately was never totally fulfilled, which means just a few people can now enjoy and appreciate it. And I would hope that because the word is being spread a little bit more, that more and more people will appreciate it. A couple of dealers that I've spoken to who've had Gordon Keebles pass through their hands are very enthusiastic and assure me that more people will want to have something as distinctive as that.
Although the ultimate outcome of the Gordon Keeble venture was sad and painful, we all had many wonderful experiences to enjoy and remember. There was a great team of people, all highly committed and taking great pride in producing a superb product. From a personal point of view, I've never regretted the venture, in spite of its failure and its substantial cost. And given the time over again, I'd probably encourage my father to go ahead, even though I have severe doubts about whether it could ever have been successful without more resources. My father was, of course, heartbroken that his dream had been shattered and that the world had lost a car in which he believed so passionately. However, had he been here now, he would have been thrilled, as I am, to see the success of the Gordon Keeble Owners Club and to know that so many years after the cars were produced, such a high proportion of them are still running and giving so much pleasure to their owners and others. From the thrill of driving the cars as they were meant to be driven and the pride of showing their cars to an unsuspecting public, to the sense of satisfaction that they have knowing that they are each playing their part in keeping the Gordon Keeble story alive and on our roads. So, what is the future of this remarkable car? Well, its body being fabricated from glass fibre, there's no chance of that rusting, and its engine is a tried and tested Chevrolet V8, so there shouldn't be any great difficulty keeping that running, although the chassis, being of steel, will need occasional maintenance. The key, according to many of the Gordon Keeble Owners Club members, is new blood. The current population of owners is naturally ageing, and so it's essential that the Gordon Keeble continues to be promoted and introduced to a new, younger generation of enthusiasts who will take ownership of the cars and cherish them as the current owners do. But most of all, the new generation of Gordon Keeble owners needs to enjoy the cars, drive them, show them, and continue to shine a light on this remarkable unsung supercar of the 1960s.